The morning had begun like any other travel day. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos, families juggling strollers and boarding passes, business travelers clutching coffee cups, and weary tourists searching for the right gate. Flight 237 to Denver was on time, and passengers filed aboard, one by one, unaware that within a few hours, their journey would become the kind of story people whispered about for years. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was calm, almost soothing. The hum of engines reverberated faintly through the floor, blending with the soft chatter of passengers settling into their seats. Overhead bins slammed shut as attendants worked briskly, smiles fixed in place even though their movements carried the efficiency of routine. At the very front, behind the cockpit door, Captain sat in his chair, relaxed but focused. A man in his mid-50s, with silver hair at his temples and years of experience in his eyes, had flown thousands of hours. Flying at 30,000 feet wasn't just a job for him. It was a rhythm second nature, a dance with the skis. His co-pilot, a younger officer named Dawson, checked instruments diligently, calling out readings as the jet leveled into cruising altitude. The two exchanged light conversation. Weather over Denver looked good, flight time would be just under 3 hours. All was smooth. In the cabin, the mood reflected the ease of the flight. A businessman in row 7 clicked away at his laptop, headphones on. Two children giggled in the back as their mother tried unsuccessfully to get them to settle into cartoons on a tablet. A pair of college students argued about which movie to watch. Passengers stretched, closed their eyes, or flipped open novels. It was an ordinary, uneventful flight, at least to anyone watching. Among them sat a man near the middle of the cabin, quiet and unassuming. He wore a dark jacket, plain jeans, and carried nothing more than a small duffel tucked under the seat in front of him. His earbuds were in, but he wasn't really listening to music. His eyes drifted occasionally to the window, where white clouds drifted lazily by. There was a calmness to his presence, something almost deliberate in the way he held himself. Unlike others who shifted nervously during turbulence or fidgeted with, he seemed grounded, unshaken. Few noticed him. Passengers glanced past him without much thought. Even the flight attendants who made their rounds with practiced cheer didn't linger. He was just another traveler blending into the crowd. But if someone had looked closer, if they had studied the stillness of his gaze or the sharpness in his posture, they might have sensed something different. This was not a man easily rattled. The flight attendants moved down the aisle with drink carts, clinking ice into cups, offering soda and coffee with gentle voices. The man accepted a glass of water, nodding his thanks. He sipped once, then returned to watching the clouds. From the intercom, Captain's voice came over, warm, professional, carrying the reassurance of routine. "Ladies, and this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. Weather ahead looks clear, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. We'll be arriving in Denver on schedule." A ripple of relief always followed such announcements. Passengers leaned back, some drifting into naps, others opening laptops again. The steady hum of the engines was almost hypnotic, lulling many into a sense of calm. The quiet man shifted in his seat, his hand brushing against the small duffel at his feet. His gaze lingered on the sign, glowing faintly above the aisle, before drifting back to the window. Nothing about his demeanor suggested urgency or worry, only patience, as though he were waiting for something unseen. The hours stretched smoothly. Flight attendants laughed softly as they stowed the empty carts. The co-pilot adjusted dials in the cockpit while Captain hummed tunelessly. Above the clouds, it felt as though nothing could disturb the stillness. No one on Flight 237 could have guessed how quickly that stillness would shatter. For now, it was just another journey in the sky, another routine flight where strangers shared air and space for a few short hours. But hidden in the quiet rhythm of the cabin, seated among them, was a man who carried with him a past that could change everything. At 30,000 feet, surrounded by unsuspecting passengers. He looked like just another face in the crowd. Yet before long, every eye in that aircraft would turn toward him, clinging to his calm as if it were the only thing keeping them alive. The calm didn't last. Barely 40 minutes into the flight, a sudden bump rattled the aircraft. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a pocket of turbulence, the kind of thing seasoned travelers shrugged off. Drinks sloshed slightly in their cups, and a few passengers tightened their grip on the armrests. Children squealed, some in fright, others in delight, mistaking it for a ride. In the cockpit, however, the mood shifted. Co-pilot Dawson glanced nervously at the gauges, his voice steady but edged with alertness. "Bit of rough air ahead," he said. Captain gave a half smile, the kind of reassuring expression only a veteran pilot could muster. "Seen worse 100 times." But then, without warning, his words cut off. Dawson turned to see slump forward in his seat, his head striking the panel with a dull thud. His hand slipped from the controls, his entire body gone limp. For a heartbeat, Dawson froze, disbelief surging through him. "Captain?" His voice cracked. He reached out, shaking shoulder. No response. The older man's face had drained of color, his breathing shallow and uneven. Panic stabbed through Dawson's chest, but he forced it down. His hand darted to the control column, steadying the aircraft as alarms began to chirp in protest. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he barked into the radio, his training taking over. His other hand fumbled for the intercom. In the cabin, the passengers heard it, the quiver in the flight attendant's voice as she spoke. "Ladies, and if there is a doctor, please make yourself known immediately. We have a medical emergency." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unreal. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A fork clattered onto a tray. For a long moment, the only sound was the endless hum of the engines. Then came the ripple, questions whispered in alarm, nervous gasps, children asking their parents what was happening. Two passengers, both doctors, hurried toward the front, guided by the crew. But even as they disappeared into the cockpit, dread seemed to thicken. The phrase medical emergency was vague, but in the confined space of a flying aircraft, everyone understood the stakes. If the captain was unwell, who was in control? The quiet man in the middle row lifted his head, earbuds dangling loosely now. His eyes sharpened, focusing on the aisle where flight attendants moved quickly, their calm masks starting to crack. He noticed details others missed, the hushed urgency in their whispers, the tight grip one of them had on the intercom handset, the way the co-pilot's voice carried faintly from the cockpit, strained and uncertain. All around him, passengers leaned toward one another, exchanging fragments of overheard words. "The pilot, something's wrong with the pilot. Is he sick? Who's flying the plane?" Panic spread like electricity. A baby began to wail, setting off another child, and suddenly the cabin was a storm of noise. The businessman in row 7 muttered angrily, trying to mask his fear. The college students whispered frantically. A woman clutched her rosary beads, her lips moving in silent prayer. Fear took 1,000 forms, but they all carried the same weight: uncertainty. In the cockpit, the doctors worked frantically over. One shouted for the AED kit, another checked his pulse. The co-pilot's hands gripped the controls so tightly his knuckles whitened. His radio crackled with questions from air traffic control. Confirm status of the captain, confirm ability to continue flight. Dawson's voice wavered as he answered. "Captain is incapacitated, attempting to maintain course." The words sent a chill through the ground crews, and though the passengers didn't hear that transmission directly, they felt the truth of it in their bones. Back in the cabin, the quiet man sat. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but inside, gears were turning. He knew the signs, knew the sharp edge of crisis when it descended without warning. Others were flailing in confusion, but to him, the situation was familiar, eerily familiar. He removed his earbuds entirely, coiling the cord neatly. The decision forming in his mind was one he had avoided for years. For now, he said nothing. He simply watched, measured, and waited, while the aircraft at 30,000 feet carried a silent weight no one was ready for. The turbulence had passed, but inside the cabin the real storm had only just begun. The cabin, once filled with casual chatter and the soft rustle of magazines, had transformed into a theater of anxiety. Whispers collided with frightened gasps, creating a low, nervous hum that no one could escape. People looked to one another, hoping for reassurance, but only finding their own fear mirrored back. Children clung to their parents, sensing the unease without understanding it. A teenager pulled her hoodie over her head, muffling sobs as her friend tried unsuccessfully to comfort her. The businessman who had been confidently typing minutes earlier now sat frozen, eyes darting toward the cockpit door. A flight attendant hurried past him, her practiced smile replaced by a mask of pale determination. Every small detail fueled the panic. The intercom had gone silent. The aisle was no longer a place of routine service, but a passage of hurried footsteps and whispered consultations. The doctors still hadn't returned from the cockpit, and that absence carried its own message. If the problem were small, wouldn't they have reassured the passengers by now? Near the back, a mother tried soothing her child with soft words, but her hands trembled too much to keep the cup of juice steady. In the middle rows, a man leaned over to his, murmuring, "I heard the captain," he collapsed. The words traveled like sparks, whispered from one row to another until the entire cabin burned with the rumor. The pilot collapsed. Who's flying the plane? Are we in danger? The questions layered over each other, unanswered, and with every passing second, the silence from the cockpit became louder than any engine roar. The co-pilot's voice finally broke through, filtered through the intercom. It carried a forced steadiness, but beneath it, passengers caught the tremor of fear. "Ladies, and this is your first officer. Please remain calm. We are in control of the aircraft. I repeat, we are in control. Thank you for your cooperation." But his reassurance only made the unease sharper. The way he said "we" made people wonder who exactly was in control: the doctor, the co-pilot alone, and if so, could he manage it? The quiet man in seat 14C sat still, his earbuds now tucked away, his attention fixed on the aisle. He'd been trained to read situations like this, not from the perspective of a nervous passenger, but from someone who had lived through crises at 30,000 feet in very different skis. The ripple of fear, the shallow breathing, the restless movements, all of it painted a picture he recognized. This was the beginning of chaos, the dangerous tipping point when fear could spread faster than reason. A flight attendant stopped near him, fumbling with the intercom handset. Her hands trembled just enough for him to notice. She tried to reassure the nearest passengers, but her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes, however, betrayed the truth. They flicked briefly toward the cockpit door, then down the aisle, as if searching desperately for a solution she didn't have. The man leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. He hadn't wanted this, not today, not ever again. He had walked away from this life years ago, leaving behind the adrenaline, the responsibility, the endless tension of decisions that carried life-or-death consequences. But sitting here, watching the fragile structure of calm collapse around him, he felt the weight of inevitability. Fear around him swelled. A passenger demanded answers, his voice rising, cutting through the whispers. Another tried to stand, only to be urged back into his seat by a flight attendant. The sound of crying grew louder, overlapping with prayers murmured in different languages. And still, through it all, the quiet man remained composed, his breathing steady, his eyes clear. His silence wasn't apathy, it was calculation. He was measuring the moment, waiting for the point when his decision would matter most. When the co-pilot's voice cracked again over the intercom, this time shorter, more clipped, asking for patience, he knew that moment was close. He slid his hands onto the armrests, leaning forward slightly, the way a soldier might shift before standing to attention. The time for waiting was ending. Soon, every soul on this plane would be looking for someone, anyone, who could pull them back from the brink. And though he had sworn never to wear that responsibility again, the sky had a way of dragging old call signs back into the light. He exhaled slowly, his eyes settling on the cockpit door. The storm outside had passed, but inside this plane the real turbulence was just beginning. The tension in the cabin had stretched to its breaking point. The co-pilot's voice had gone silent again, replaced by the faint hum of the engines and the restless sounds of frightened passengers. No one was settled anymore. Clicked as people shifted in their seats, craning their necks toward the cockpit door, searching for answers that weren't coming. It was in this charged silence that the quiet man moved. He pulled himself upright, sliding his duffel bag slightly farther under the seat with a motion that was both casual and deliberate. His eyes scanned the aisle, and for the first time he stood. The nearest passengers noticed immediately. They watched him rise with a stillness that didn't match the frantic energy around him. There was something about the way he held himself, measured, unshaken, commanding without even trying, that caught attention. A flight attendant rushing past nearly collided with him. She stopped, startled, then tried to guide him back into his seat with a polite but firm voice. "Sir, please remain seated. We need everyone calm right now." But his response wasn't frantic, nor was it the panicked outburst of a nervous passenger. His voice was steady, low, with a quiet authority that cut through the noise like a blade. "Tell your first officer," he said, "that I can help." The attendant blinked, confused. She glanced at him as though he were joking or worse, unstable. But then she saw his expression. There was no tremor in his voice, no flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't asking. He was informing. "I think we need medical," she began, but he interrupted gently, firmly. "Not medical." His gaze flicked toward the cockpit door. "Flying." The word hung in the air, absurd at first, as though it couldn't possibly be real. A passenger, flying a jetliner. The attendant frowned. "Sir, unless you're—" And then he said it. A single phrase, sharp and clipped, delivered with the kind of precision that only came from years of repetition. It was not his name, but his call sign. "Ghost Rider." The flight attendant froze, the words catching her completely off guard. She had no frame of reference for them, but the tone in which he spoke was impossible to dismiss. And when she repeated it into the cockpit intercom, the reaction on the other end removed all doubt. Inside, the co-pilot's voice cracked over the speaker. "Say again." "Ghost Rider," she repeated, hesitant. "One of the passengers says he can't help." There was a pause, long, heavy, filled with disbelief. And then the co-pilot's voice came back, sharper, urgent, stripped of all doubt. "Get him up here, now." The attendant turned to the man, her eyes wide. She didn't know the meaning of the call sign, not exactly, but the reaction from the cockpit told her everything she needed. Whoever this man was, he wasn't bluffing. Whispers spread like fire through the cabin. Passengers leaned toward each other, voices overlapping in hushed awe. "He said he can fly." "What did he tell her?" "Did she say the pilot asked for him?" The quiet man, Ghost Rider, didn't explain, didn't justify. He simply stepped forward, moving down the aisle with the same calm resolve he'd carried since the beginning. People turned in their seats to watch him, their fear momentarily replaced by curiosity, even hope. As he neared the cockpit, the murmur grew louder. "Is he really a pilot?" someone asked. Another whispered, "Military, he has to be military." When the cockpit door opened, revealing the pale, sweat-soaked face of the co-pilot, there was no doubt left. His expression carried both relief and desperation. He stepped aside quickly, gesturing Ghost Rider in. And just like that, the quiet man vanished behind the reinforced door, leaving the passengers buzzing in shock. To them, it felt like watching a stranger transform before their eyes. Only moments ago, he'd been invisible, just another face in the crowd. Now he carried a call sign, the weight of authority, and every fragile hope they had left. For the first time since the captain's collapse, the cabin's panic began to shift. Not disappear, no, the fear was still there, but soften, replaced by something they hadn't felt in what seemed like hours. The beginning of trust. The cockpit felt than the quiet man remembered. The walls seemed to press in with the hum of instruments, the glow of gauges, and the tense breathing of the co-pilot. Yet the moment he stepped inside, the space changed. The panic that had hung heavy a second earlier shifted, replaced by something else: order. The co-pilot, Dawson, stared at him with wide eyes. He looked barely 30, his hands trembling against the controls. Sweat ran down his temple, his voice shaky when he spoke. Your Ghost Rider." The quiet man nodded once, his eyes already scanning the instruments. "What's your status?" His tone was clipped, precise, no wasted words. Dawson blinked as if forcing himself back into professionalism. "Captain collapsed, unresponsive. Doctors are with him now. I can keep us steady, but—" His voice trailed off, the implication clear. "I can't land this alone." Ghost Rider slid into the captain's chair. His movements carried the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, even though it had been years since he last sat at the controls of an aircraft. His fingers moved over the switches with the instinctive familiarity of muscle memory. "Tower, this is Flight 237, Dawson said into the radio, his voice regaining a thread of composure. We have Ghost Rider at the controls." The response on the other end was immediate and stunned. "Say again." "Ghost Rider," Dawson repeated firmly. "He's here, he's taking over." There was a pause, then a burst of chatter. Ghost Rider leaned forward, taking the mic. His voice cut through the static with calm authority. "Denver Center, this is Ghost Rider. I have the aircraft. State nearest viable runway." The line went quiet again. Air traffic controllers exchanged hurried words. Some of them hadn't heard that call sign in years, but they knew it. Everyone in aviation circles knew it. Ghost Rider wasn't just a nickname. It was a legend. Years earlier, he had flown combat missions no one wanted to talk about in public. High-risk sorties in hostile airspace, missions that required precision under fire, decisions that balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. He had earned his call sign not in training, but in the crucible of real war, where hesitation meant a body bag. And then, after surviving where others hadn't, he had disappeared, walked away. Some said he couldn't handle the politics anymore. Others whispered it was the weight of all the missions, all the lives that had finally driven him into anonymity. Whatever the reason, Ghost Rider had become a name attached to stories told quietly in ready rooms and hangars, a shadow of a pilot who once commanded the skis. And now, out of nowhere, his voice was back on the radio. "Ghost Rider, Denver Center," the controller finally replied, his tone steadier but edged with awe. "We copy you at the controls. Current position 35 miles east of Cheyenne. Nearest emergency runway available at Air Force Base. Winds cross at 15 knots. "Copy," Ghost Rider answered without hesitation. "Diverting to, keep emergency services on standby." Dawson exhaled, some of the terror draining from his face. He still shook, but the burden of decision had lifted. He wasn't alone anymore. Behind the cockpit door, the passengers had no idea of the conversations taking place, but they sensed the shift. Fear still lingered, but there was something else now: curiosity, hope. The whispers traveled fast. "He's a pilot, a real one, military." Inside, Ghost Rider adjusted the heading, his eyes sharp on the instruments. Dawson glanced at him, voice hushed. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, why are you here? Why now?" Ghost Rider didn't look up. His voice was even, but there was a shadow behind it. "Because I promised myself I'd never fly again. But sometimes," he tightened his grip on the yoke, "the sky doesn't give you a choice." Cockpit, once chaotic, now hummed with focus. Ghost Rider's hands moved across the controls like an artist returning to his craft, every adjustment precise, every motion steady. The co-pilot, Dawson, followed his lead instinctively, sensing that this man wasn't just another pilot, he was something else entirely. The radio crackled with updates. Ghost Rider Denver Center, confirm heading 310, runway at cleared, wind steady cross at 15, gusting 20. Copy, Ghost Rider replied smoothly. His voice was calm, clipped, the kind of tone that bred confidence even in chaos. Vectoring 2, estimated approach in 30 minutes. Keep medics standing by for captain. The words sounded simple, routine, but the reality was anything but. Landing a fully loaded commercial jetliner wasn't the same as maneuvering a fighter. This aircraft was massive, sluggish, and carried hundreds of lives. The margin for error was razor-thin. Dawson glanced nervously at him. "Sir, I can help with the systems, but have you ever flown one of these before?" Ghost Rider didn't take his eyes from the horizon. "Not this model, but I know the principles, and principles don't change." It was the kind of answer that would have rattled another man, but Dawson felt the opposite. He saw in Ghost Rider's face the rare steel of someone who had stared down worse odds than this, and won. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin remained tense. Whispers drifted through the rows like smoke. Some passengers clutched hands in prayer, others tried to mask fear with forced optimism. But what kept everyone anchored was the memory of the quiet man, Ghost Rider, walking confidently to the cockpit. For reasons they couldn't explain, they trusted him, even without knowing his story. The intercom clicked again, Dawson's voice steadier now. "Ladies, and this is your first officer. We're diverting to Air Force Base for an emergency landing. We have a highly qualified pilot assisting us. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." The word qualified wasn't enough to explain the truth, but it shifted the atmosphere. Hope replaced raw panic. People still gripped their armrests tightly, but the edge of despair softened into cautious faith. Inside the cockpit, Ghost Rider adjusted trim, eyes flicking from instruments to the cloud-streaked horizon. Memories stirred as muscle memory took over. Long nights flying missions through hostile skies, the roar of engines under fire, the sound of voices counting on him through static-filled radios. "Gear check," he ordered. Dawson scrambled, flicking switches, reporting back in rapid rhythm. For the first time since the collapse, Dawson wasn't leading, he was following. And strangely, it felt right. Denver Center broke in again. "Ghost Rider, you have priority. Traffic rerouted. Expect light turbulence on descent. Tower will guide you final." "Roger," Ghost Rider said, his voice like iron. "Maintain clear airspace. We'll call final." For a brief second, Dawson allowed himself to exhale. The plane was steady, systems functional, the path clear. But as if the skis themselves were unwilling to let the landing come easy, turbulence struck again. The jet lurched violently, jolting passengers from their seats. Screams echoed through the cabin. Oxygen masks swung slightly in their compartments, rattling with each shudder. Dawson grabbed the column instinctively, but Ghost Rider's hand was already there, firm and controlled. "Easy," Ghost Rider murmured, steadying the aircraft. His voice carried no panic, just focus. "Ride the wave, don't fight it." The plane leveled, the turbulence easing. Dawson's chest heaved, but Ghost Rider remained composed, his eyes locked forward. He knew the hardest part was still ahead. Landing a plane of this size in crosswinds demanded not only precision, but a kind of calm that few pilots possessed. He glanced briefly at Dawson, seeing the younger man's pale face and shaking hands. "You're doing fine," Ghost Rider said, his tone softer for the first time. "But listen, when we hit approach, I'll need you sharp. This bird doesn't forgive mistakes." Dawson nodded, swallowing hard. Something about Ghost Rider's confidence bled into him, steadying his nerves. Outside the cockpit, passengers sat in a fragile silence, gripping the hope that someone in control knew what he was doing. They didn't know the details of vectors, altitudes, or crosswinds. All they knew was this: a stranger had stepped forward, and suddenly, survival seemed possible again. As Air Force Base loomed closer on the radar, Ghost Rider tightened his grip on the yoke. His past and present collided in this moment. The pilot he once was, the man he had become, and the hundreds of lives depending on him now. This was no training exercise, no combat sortie. This was real, and failure was not an option. The runway lights at Air Force Base shimmered faintly on the horizon, a glowing strip of hope cutting through the darkness. Ghost Rider narrowed his gaze, every nerve in his body tuned to the aircraft. The hum of the engines, the subtle vibrations of the yoke, even the faint rattle in the overhead panel, he absorbed it all like a man reacquainting himself with an old adversary. "Denver Center to Ghost Rider," the radio buzzed. "You are cleared for emergency approach, runway 27. Winds gusting 25 cross from the south. Fire and rescue are standing by." Roger, Ghost Rider replied evenly. "Commencing descent. Tower, expect heavy roll correction." Beside him, Dawson adjusted flaps and read out the checklists, his voice steadier than before though his hands still shook. He stole a glance at the man in the captain's seat. Ghost Rider didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't blink longer than a second. He was a statue of control, carved from years of experience and sharpened by fire. The descent began. The nose dipped, engines throttled back, and gravity pressed gently against the passengers' chests. In the cabin, tension swelled like a storm cloud. Children clung to their parents, prayers whispered under trembling breaths, and all eyes darted to the windows for signs of the ground. The turbulence struck again, harder this time. The plane jolted sideways, banking left as a gust slammed into its flank. Gasps erupted through the fuselage. Dawson gripped his armrest with one hand while his other clung desperately to the controls. "Crosswind," Dawson muttered, panic in his voice. "I see it," Ghost Rider said, his tone calm, his movements precise. He countered with a smooth roll, easing the yoke just enough to keep the wings level. "She's heavy, but she'll hold." The jet steadied, but only for a moment. Another gust ripped across its path, stronger, more violent, sending the aircraft rocking like a ship on stormy seas. Warnings blinked across the dashboard, alarms chirping angrily. "Altitude 4,000, descending steady," Dawson called out, his voice strained. "Good," Ghost Rider replied, eyes never leaving the runway lights ahead. His mind tunneled into focus. Years of combat came rushing back. The times he had guided aircraft through tracer fire, the nights he'd flown blind in stormy skies with nothing but gut instinct and trust in his training. This wasn't just a landing. It was a battle. Inside the cabin, oxygen masks swayed like pendulums as the aircraft bucked against the gusts. A child cried out, his small voice piercing the tense silence, and for a moment the humanity of the situation weighed heavier than the steel around them. Ghost Rider heard none of it. His world was narrowed to instruments, wind, and the shimmering beacon of the runway ahead. "Gear down," he commanded. Dawson flicked the switch. The deep thud of the landing gear deploying vibrated through the fuselage. 3 green lights glowed on the panel, confirmation they were locked in place. "Flaps 25, Ghost Rider continued, his voice clipped but calm. The jet slowed, wings adjusting as the flaps extended. The runway loomed larger now, the strip of lights clearer but still distant. Every adjustment mattered. Every second brought them closer to the moment of truth. "Altitude 2,000. On glide slope," Dawson reported. His voice quivered, but there was awe beneath the fear. Ghost Rider's hands were steady as stone, but inside, his chest tightened. He knew the crosswinds were brutal. Commercial jets weren't designed for sharp combat maneuvers, and yet he would need every ounce of his skill to hold her steady. The base tower chimed in again. "Flight 237, winds gusting 28. Repeat, 28. Cross at 27." Ghost Rider's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Copy tower, adjusting approach." He banked slightly, angling the nose into the wind. The maneuver was risky. It meant flying the aircraft nearly sideways toward the runway, a technique only seasoned pilots dared attempt. Passengers felt the tilt, gasps filling the cabin as the ground loomed closer through the windows at an unnatural angle. Hold it, Ghost Rider muttered under his breath, guiding the massive jet as if it were a fighter in hostile skis. Altitude 1,000, Dawson read, his breath coming fast. The runway lights blazed brighter, filling the windshield. Ghost Rider's grip tightened on the yoke, his other hand on the throttle. The engines roared as he adjusted power to fight the wind, every muscle in his body straining against invisible forces. Brace, 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 Dawson shouted into the intercom. Passengers ducked into position, cries muffled against knees and arms. Flight attendants braced themselves at their stations, eyes squeezed shut in prayer. The ground rushed up, the lights of emergency vehicles flickering at the runway edges. Ghost Rider's eyes burned with focus, his mind silent but for one thought: not today. The wheels neared the asphalt. The jet, massive and unwieldy, tilted against the wind, one wing dipping dangerously close to the runway. Dawson gasped, but Ghost Rider held the line, hands steady, eyes fierce. "Touchdown," Ghost Rider whispered, almost to himself. The wheels screeched against the runway. The jet bounced once hard, but Ghost Rider corrected instantly, throttling reverse, holding her center as sparks spat briefly from the wheels. The aircraft roared, brakes whining, shuddering as it fought to slow under the furious crosswind. The passengers screamed, cried, prayed. But above it all, the sound of the engines throttling down filled the night like a victorious war drum. They were down. Not safely stopped yet, but down. The jet groaned as its weight bore down on the runway, the brakes shrieking in protest. The reverse thrust bellowed, echoing across the dark expanse of Air Force Base. Emergency lights flared red and white along the tarmac, flashing like a heartbeat. Inside the cabin, passengers clung to their seats, waiting, hopping, daring not to believe they were safe. And then silence. The engines whined down, the metal bird slowing, rolling, until finally it came to a trembling stop in the embrace of emergency vehicles. For a moment there was nothing but stunned stillness, as if no one dared break the spell. Then, from somewhere in the back, a sob of relief burst free, followed by scattered applause. Within seconds the cabin erupted into cheers, claps, and tears of joy. "Ladies and," Dawson's shaky voice came over the intercom, "welcome to Air Force Base. We're on the ground." The roar of relief nearly drowned him out. In the cockpit, Ghost Rider didn't smile. He sat back, chest rising and falling, eyes locked on the dim runway lights ahead. His hands, steady through every second of the descent, finally loosened their grip on the yoke. The battle was over. Dawson turned to him, his face pale but glowing with awe. "Sir, I don't even know what to say. You saved them. You saved all of us." Ghost Rider met his eyes, his expression unreadable. "You did your part. Never forget that." His voice was quiet, almost fatherly. Outside, paramedics rushed aboard to attend to the unconscious captain. Fire crews lined the runway in case disaster had struck, but there was no fire, no wreckage. Only the sight of a massive jet resting safely where, minutes earlier, doom had seemed certain. The passengers filed off, some limping, some carrying children, others weeping openly as they touched the ground with trembling hands. News cameras had already gathered beyond the base gates, reporters shouting questions into the night, hungry for the story. Word had traveled fast. A mysterious passenger, a call sign whispered in aviation circles, had taken control of Flight 237. But by the time the media frenzy reached the terminal, Ghost Rider was gone. No one saw him leave. One moment he was in the cockpit, unbuckling with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done his duty. The next, he slipped into the stream of passengers, blending with the shaken crowd. He wore no uniform, carried no badge, and when reporters demanded names, no one could point him out. It was as if the legend had simply vanished back into the shadows. Dawson tried to explain when questioned later by Air Force officials. He wasn't just a pilot, he was Ghost Rider, You have to understand that name, it means something. I don't know where he came from or why he was on that flight, but if he hadn't been, his voice broke, we wouldn't be here. In the weeks that followed, stories spread. Some said Ghost Rider was a retired ace who had disappeared after a classified mission. Others believed he had been living quietly among civilians, hiding from a past he couldn't escape. A few even whispered that he was a myth made flesh, a ghost of aviation folklore who appeared only when fate demanded. The passengers never forgot. In living rooms and late-night conversations, they retold the moment the quiet man rose from his seat, walked calmly toward the cockpit, and turned chaos into hope. Each retelling grew sharper, etched with the raw memory of fear turned to salvation. For Ghost Rider himself, the night remained a private battle. He hadn't sought glory. He hadn't asked to be recognized. The call sign that once defined him had only been spoken again because duty had left him no choice. And when the sky called, he had answered. At 30,000 feet, where fear had threatened to consume hundreds of lives, Ghost Rider had returned, not as a myth, not as a story, but as a man. And though he slipped back into the quiet, one truth lingered, carried in the hearts of every soul on Flight 237. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they don't wait for medals. Sometimes they simply rise when the world needs them most and disappear when the job is done. The legend of Ghost Rider lived on, not in headlines, but in the gratitude of those who survived to tell the tale. And for him, that was enough.